Hey folks, so from here on out, we're going to start talking about aliens themselves. What kinds of life forms might we find on an alien planet? What might they need to eat, breathe, and all their different characteristics based on the environment that they're in. But before we can do that, we need to define, well, what is life? And that's a surprisingly difficult question. The first planet that we ever landed on was Mars in 1976. We sent the Viking spacecraft there. And the theory was is that there might be microbes in the Martian soil that are dormant. And so if we could add water, nutrients, warm them up a little bit, they might actually wake up. So the Viking spacecraft had a little scoop that scooped up some dirt, brought it into the spacecraft where it was warmer, and then it added those water and nutrients to the soil, and it woke up. And this was amazing. We're like, oh my God, there's life on Mars. But then somebody pointed out, well, wait a minute, there is a boring chemical reaction that would look very similar to this. So the question is it life or is it just chemistry? And to this day, we don't know if the Viking spacecraft found life on Mars or not, because our test just wasn't able to decide, well, what is life? So before we can go any further, we need to come up with some way that we can identify whether this alien thing is alive or not. And as I said, that's actually quite a difficult question. So we're going to look at some examples, and then I'm going to present the rules, the definitions that actual practicing astrobiologists use to define whether or not something is alive. All right, let's get started. All right, so what you see before are 6 things that we might find on an alien planet. Okay, Earth. But we've got to decide if you're an alien and you're trying to decide, is this thing alive or not? How would you decide that? So, right here, we've got some crystals that have been grown. These are rock crystals. These are bacteria. It's a puppy. Isn't he cute? A car, fire, and shrooms. Now, you probably know which of these are living and which are not. If not, well, okay, there's something wrong. But so to start off with, let's make sure that we all agree on what's living and what's not living. So the crystals, are they living or non living? Well, obviously they're not living. How about the bacteria? That's going to be living. The puppy, living. The car, well, unless you're reading a Stephen King novel, we're going to have to go with non living. Although, if you think about a Tesla and some of the other cars like that, they're getting a lot closer to being intelligent. How about fire? Well, with the wildfires that we've had, sometimes it may seem like they're intelligent, but no, they're actually non living. Shrooms? Mushrooms are definitely living. Okay. So it's pretty easy to just look at these and decide which one's living and which one's not living. However, what we want you to do is to look at those 6 objects. Now, based on which ones you've decided are living and which ones are non living, I want you to come up with 6 characteristics of life, 6 tests that we can do to see if something is alive. All right, so 6 rules. What I want you to do though is pause the video and don't peek at the back. You're missing out on the game otherwise. All right, so just look at the front of your class notes here. You're going to write down 6 characteristics that can be used to determine if something's alive. Pause the video now. This is going to take you a little while, so think about it. Okay, so have you thought about it? So what are some of the things you came up with? Some of the more common things that we see, for example, people may say, okay, well, it's living if it grows. Well, crystals certainly grow. So would that mean they're living? Well, probably not. All right. Well, you might say, well, okay, it uses fuel to support itself. Well, in that case, both the car and the fire are going to be living. You might say, oh, well, it reproduces. Cars certainly don't reproduce. Well, that's true, but fire does. So you can start to see some of the complexities, even with things that we know are going to be living and non living. Now, if you're an alien, though, and you've never seen one of these, you see this crystal and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Is that alive? Or is it just a chemistry process that's going on? You see the fire and it reproduces, it spawns copies of itself. Is fire alive? Well, if you're an alien, you might have never seen fire before, you might not be sure. So astrobiologists have sat down and they've thought about these things, and they've thought about the 6 rules that we can use for determining if something is alive. And that's what we're going to go through here. The first and most important one is that it's got order. So something that's just random, like fire, for example, doesn't have an order. So generally speaking, the molecules have to be arranged in some kind of structure. Now we might call those cells. The aliens might be arranged in something else, but it's going to be an analog of cells, something that gives the body some sort of structure. And maybe those cells, are big enough that you could actually hold them. Maybe they're microscopic like ours are. So this is an example of some microbial life forms that are organized according to cells. Well, now this book also has order, doesn't it? And so those cells, might be the words on the page. There is knowledge, there's wisdom stored in here, Padawan. So that has order. And the crystals certainly has order as well. It's not just random. Those crystals all have the same shape and the same structure as they grow. So we can definitely say that it needs order, but just having order isn't enough. So one way to say that is it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. The second characteristic that it has to have, it has to be able to reproduce. So it's got to be able to pass on some sort of analog of genetic material. Now for us, that's DNA, of course, and that's that for all life forms on Earth. It might not necessarily be DNA, but in some way for it to reproduce, to make a copy of itself, it's got to have those instructions for that copy so that it can pass those on. So one example then, this is obviously a cell and it's divided. We had one cell and it used its DNA to make a copy of itself. So that's reproduction. However, do you know what this is? This is a mule. So a mule is a cross between a horse and a donkey, and all mules are sterile. They cannot reproduce. So does that mean mules aren't alive because they don't have reproduction? That's kind of a problem, isn't it? This is a virus. We've all become very familiar with that recently. And so if this is a virus, is it alive? A virus cannot reproduce unless it infects another host. It has to take over the DNA that's in an existing cell and it modifies that DNA, and that's how it reproduces. But left to itself, the virus is going to die. It can't survive. It doesn't have any way of actually reproducing. So it is alive. Is it alive or is it not? And doctors actually debate this. These are called prions, and they work kind of similarly to a virus. The most famous ones are the things that cause mad cow disease. It gets in the brain, and it is a life form, but again, it can't reproduce on its own. It needs those structures from the DNA in the brain in order to reproduce. So reproduction, okay, yeah, you'd say it needs to reproduce, but say somebody decides that they want to have their tubes tied, or maybe the person was born sterile. Does that mean they're not alive? Well, no, of course not. They're still alive. So one way to think about it is they are the product of reproduction. So this mule is the product of reproduction, even though itself cannot reproduce. So the life form itself has to at least have come from reproduction, even if it can't reproduce on its own. The third thing is that all organisms grow and develop over time. So these are my daughters when they were very little and very cute. This is when they're a little bit older. You can see that they've grown and they've developed over time. Now they're actually, one's going off to college and the other one's in high school. But there's a big difference between the way they looked when they were itty bitty and the way they looked when they were kids. Fire, of course, grows and develops over time as well. And we would argue that fire is probably not alive. So again, this is one of those necessary but not sufficient conditions. If it's going to be alive, it has to grow and develop. But just because it grows and develops doesn't mean that it's alive. So the next one we talked about is energy utilization. We talked about this with the car. So it's got to take in nutrients and extract energy from that. And then from that, that maintains its order structure. Because remember, it has to have order or else it's not going to be alive. Well, the car certainly takes in energy and uses that, but it doesn't use it necessarily to maintain itself. It uses it to perform its functions, though. So again, you might say that it has to use energy in order for it to be alive. If it's just a rock just sitting there, well, it's not using any energy, and so therefore it can't be alive. But just using energy is not enough. It's got to do this along with the other things that we've talked about. The other one is got to respond to its environment. So dogs don't sweat, as you probably know, but when they get hot, they start to pant because then the saliva starts to evaporate, and that's how they cool themselves down. So they're responding to changes in their environment, and that's allowing them, and so they're pant so that they'll cool themselves down. So a living organism will always respond to its environment in some way. A rock, again, is not going to change, generally speaking, according to its environment. Well, you've probably got one of these in your house. It certainly responds to changes in the environment, but we would argue that your thermostat's not alive. Now, things are getting smarter and smarter and smarter. So at some point, you might ask yourself, well, is Alexa alive? Is Siri alive? Well, that's a hard choice. Right now, we would probably say no, they do respond to their environment, but they respond in a programmed way. They don't meet all of the other requirements that we have, but they're getting closer. And so eventually we might be able to say, hey, there is an AI system that meets all of our definitions from this. This, however, is the key. Now, life has to have all of those, all the previous 5 characteristics that we talked about. However, if it has this one, then it is definitely alive. No non living system, no non living thing has the ability to evolve and adapt over time with successive generations. Only life can do that. So you might say, well, why don't we just make this our definition of life, right? If it can evolve, then it's alive. Well, that would be great, except that these evolutionary adaptations take place over millions of years. And so, unless you want to wait millions of years to find out it's alive, you're going to need something else. But this is the most important thing. So, here's an example. That's a bug. Now, this bug didn't just suddenly decide, oh, I think I'll look like a leaf so I don't get eaten. However, what happened was there was a bug that probably started out, nice, fat green bug. And then there was a mutation that occurred, just a random change. One looked a little bit different from his parents. He was a little bit taller than he was wide. And that's it. He still looked like a bug, but he was just a little bit taller. Well, that bug is going to be less likely to get eaten than the one that's flat and crawling around. Because initially the predator might say, oh, wait, that's a leaf, and then go for somebody else first. So the whole idea of evolutionary adaptation is that you have traits that allow you to survive to have babies. Any trait that lets you be more likely to have babies will tend to survive. Now, that trait may be good in one environment and bad in another. And we're going to look at that in the next lesson from that. So, over time, there were small changes, just mutations. And some mutations made it actually worse. Some made it more like what you see right here. Evolution isn't smart. It isn't survival of the fittest in the sense of you're going to continually get better and better. That's not what's happening. It's just random, but some are better for the environment that it's in than others. This particular bug, over many generations, has evolved into something that makes it very hard for the predators to see him as being separate from a leaf. And so, therefore, he's more likely to survive to have babies. So, evolutionary adaptation is the key feature of life. But it has to have all 6. But if it has this one, it will have all of the other ones as well. It's just this is the hardest one to test for. So with these 6 characteristics, then, you can test whether any organism is actually alive or not, including AI organisms. And I think that's going to be a really interesting, kind of exciting field from here on out. So life on our planet is based on carbon. Now, we talked about how carbon is one of the most abundant elements in the universe. So hydrogen, helium, oxygen, carbon are the most abundant. And we talked about how helium actually doesn't react with anything. And so there's no way that one's going to work for us because it just doesn't react with anything. But that still leaves these 3 right here. So hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon actually are the source of all organic molecules. And carbon is the key. Now, on Earth, most of our hydrogen and oxygen is actually tied up in the oceans. Carbon, though, is everywhere. It's in the rocks. It's in what's now life. So it's possible for something out in space to be based on something other than carbon. But given that carbon is so prevalent, it's so common because it's made, it's the first thing that's going to be made whenever we have a star that's evolving. So it's going to be out there. There's going to be plenty out there. And it has special abilities like water does that allow it to be good for encoding these complex aspects of life. So first of all, it's abundant, but then it's also versatile because it can bond with 4 different atoms and it can form a number of different kinds of bonds. It can form double bonds, it can form single bonds, it can form these ring bonds. So out of this one molecule, you can, out of this one atom, you can get a whole bunch of different molecules. And life needs complexity. Life is complex. And there is nothing out there like carbon that has that level of complexity. The closest you could figure is probably silicon. And if you look here on the periodic chart, carbon and silicon have similar properties. So because they both all lie in the same column here in the periodic chart, they're going to have very similar chemical properties. However, because silicon is a lot bigger than carbon, it's got much weaker bonds. It's also much less abundant because it's not being made in stars until you get to, very end stages. Only in the very high mass stars are going to produce any silicon at all. Also, silicon can't form a double bond the way carbon is, so you've already lost some of your complexity there. The other big thing is when you combine it with oxygen, which is going to be our normal way of moving carbon or whatever around, carbon dioxide is a gas. Silicon dioxide is sand. It's beach sand. And so it's a solid. So you would have to find some way to dissolve it in order to get it across cell wall barriers, whereas carbon dioxide is just always there. So it's a lot less mobile in the environment. And that's going to be true of all the other kinds of bonds that we can make with carbon. So when we're looking at the different types of organic molecules, the fundamental building block of making these proteins, and proteins, of course, are what basically build the structure of life. These are called amino acids. Now, there are two different kinds of amino acids, called left-handed and right-handed. And if you look here, we've got an example of a left-handed amino acid and a right-handed amino acid. And we call it that because notice that there's no way to rotate this molecule to match this one. It's a mirror image rather than being rotated. Now, in non-biological sources of amino acids, they're about 50-50. So probably early in Earth's history, there evolved life forms that were left-handed and life forms that are right-handed, meaning the amino acids were left-handed and right-handed. However, on Earth right now, all biological sources are left-handed. All of them. There are no examples of a right-handed amino acid biological source. What probably happened is whatever life form developed under left-handed amino acids had some other sort of advantage that it allowed it to outcompete the right-handed. Well, the thing is if you're based on left-handed amino acids, these right-handed amino acids are absolutely worthless to you. You can't use them in any of your chemical reactions that you need to maintain life. And there's actually a science fiction story. There was a guy who was flipped in the fourth dimension. So he became basically a mirror of himself. And so all of his amino acids flipped. And he could eat all that he wanted, and he still starved to death because he felt completely full, but he couldn't use any of the amino acids. So if we land on another planet, it's entirely possible that the life forms there are going to be based on right-handed amino acids. We could eat them, but they aren't going to help us. We aren't going to be able to survive on them. Now, there are over 70 known amino acids. All of Earth life only uses 20 of them. So we're only using a tiny fraction of the potential of amino acids that are out there. What kind of life forms do you get if you use the other 50? That's not something that's been really explored, but it's something that astrobiologists are, of course, very interested in because aliens may be based on this. Maybe this is where superpowers come from. They're able to use some of these other amino acids that aren't being used by life forms on Earth. All right, so this is just kind of a quick introduction. Now, when you're downloading your practice for this one's going to be a little challenging. We're going to give you 3 objects, and I want you to tell me if they're living or non-living. Okay, you're going to look at them. You're going to know, is it living or non-living? Okay, so we're going to have a cloud, a tree, and the ocean. Now, when I'm talking about the ocean, I'm talking about the water itself, not anything that's living in the ocean, but the water itself from the ocean. And so you're probably going to immediately say, oh, well, living or non-living, whatever. But what I want you to show is which of the 6 characteristics does it actually have? So you're going to circle the ones that it actually has. If you think that it has order, then you'll circle order. If it's alive, it's going to have all 6 of them. And so you're going to have to give an example of all 6. So it's going to be kind of a challenging one for you. So think about it. It's deceptively simple. Okay, so now that you have your definition of life, you're equipped to, whenever you get your alien, you can look for these 6 characteristics to be able to confirm that it's actually life. Now, we're going to assume that if you have a habitable planet, then there is an intelligent alien species there. So you can assume that, but now you can use these 6 characteristics to kind of give you a better clue as to what it's like. And also, you know what? If you find an alien sitting out on the street somewhere, you can say, are you actually alive? And you're going to be able to actually compare these and figure out if it's alive. once the fundamental question is answered, you can move on from there. All right, we'll see you next time.